Tonight we begin with a strike that Western intelligence officials had feared, Russian analysts had dismissed, and Ukrainian commanders had meticulously prepared for over months. A strike that unfolded not over weeks or days, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the trajectory of this war. Hours that sent shockwaves through every capital from Washington to Beijing. Hours that forced Vladimir Putin to confront a reality he never believed possible. What Ukraine did today crossed a line that every government on earth had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Russia did not hesitate. They responded with fury, with threats, and with a promise that has put the entire world on edge. Total annihilation. Those were the words used by the Kremlin tonight. And for the first time since this war began, those words carry a weight that no one, not NATO, not the Pentagon, not even the Kremlin itself, can fully predict. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official Ukrainian military channels, not from Western governments, just signals that Kyiv was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their strikes have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a rhythm. Fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, command centers, air defense systems, targets that hurt Russia's war machine without crossing the invisible lines that could trigger something far worse. But what set off alarm bells in Western intelligence circles this week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Ukrainian drone activity know the indicators, the movement of long-range assets to forward positions, the sudden uptick in encrypted communications between Kyiv and its special operations units, the positioning of reconnaissance drones along corridors that had been dormant for months, the sudden pause in publicly announced strikes. All of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence officials in Washington began issuing internal warnings 3 days ago. They didn't know what Ukraine was planning. They didn't know when it would happen. But they knew something was coming, something big, something that would change everything. Early this morning, Russian air defense systems detected what they described as multiple unidentified aerial objects approaching from the southwest, including drone signatures that had not been observed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Ukraine only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, a message to the Russian military, a message to Putin himself, or a message to the entire world. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Ukraine was changing its entire posture. And when a nation at war shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The first reports came from Russian military bloggers, then from residents near Sochi, then from satellite imagery analysts who noticed something that made their blood run cold: smoke, rising from a compound that was never supposed to be touched, a compound that sits on the Black Sea coast, a compound that serves as one of Vladimir Putin's personal residences, the so-called Putin Palace, the lavish estate that became famous after opposition leader Alexei Navalny's investigation, had been struck. Not symbolic graffiti, not a nearby explosion meant to send a message, a direct hit, multiple direct hits, and the world held its breath. The response issued by the Kremlin tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Spokesperson after spokesperson, official after official, described Ukraine's strike as unprecedented, an act of terrorism against the Russian state, and perhaps most importantly, an attack on the personal security of the president of the Russian Federation, something Moscow has repeatedly warned would trigger consequences beyond imagination. But threats only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most defiant we've seen since February 2022. Here's what we know. Within hours of the strike being confirmed, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky appeared on camera. He did not deny the attack. He did not apologize. He did not offer diplomatic platitudes. He said simply, "Russia brought this war to our homes. Now they understand what that feels like." These weren't the carefully worded statements we've seen from Kyiv in the past. This was a direct acknowledgement, something Ukraine has rarely done with high-profile strikes. And that acknowledgement was itself a message that said, we did this, we meant to do this, and we are not afraid of what comes next. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched a coordinated drone attack on targets across southern Russia, including Putin's Black Sea residence that had recently been upgraded with additional security infrastructure for what analysts believe was an extended presidential visit planned for next month. Ukraine struck before Putin could arrive. They hit the main residential complex. They hit the security perimeter. They hit support facilities that were likely preparing to receive the Russian president and his inner circle. In other words, Ukraine targeted the logistical backbone of Putin's personal security apparatus, the infrastructure that would have made his visit possible. This is what made Western officials' reactions so urgent. Ukraine's strike wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the dynamics of this conflict if left unchecked. And Russia, understanding that fully, responded with threats that have not been heard since the earliest days of the invasion. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately. They didn't threaten random retaliation. They didn't issue vague warnings. They specifically stated that Ukraine's leadership, Ukraine's government buildings, and Ukraine's critical infrastructure would face total annihilation. Those words, broadcast on Russian state television within hours of the strike, were chosen carefully. They were designed to terrify. They were designed to intimidate. And they were designed to signal to the world that Russia considers this attack a fundamental escalation. And here's where the story becomes even more dangerous. Western intelligence officials now believe that Ukraine's strike was designed to test the psychological resilience of the Russian leadership after months of battlefield setbacks and internal political pressure. Ukraine wanted to see whether Putin would respond with immediate military action or retreat into rhetoric. But instead, something unexpected happened. Russia didn't launch an immediate retaliatory strike. They mobilized a response that was so coordinated, so multi-layered, that even Ukrainian military planners noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under condition of anonymity described Russia's shift as siege mentality, a way to consolidate control while preparing for something much larger. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to strike at the heart of Russian power. Their drones were not only precise, they were timed so carefully that Russian air defenses failed to intercept a single one of the attacking aircraft. That detail matters because it shows something profound about Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it. They are studying Russian patterns. They are exploiting Russian weaknesses. And they are doing so with a sophistication that has caught Moscow completely off guard. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's operation. Ukrainian special forces carried out reconnaissance missions along the Russian border, forcing Russian units to redeploy from frontline positions. Ukrainian cyber units targeted Russian communications infrastructure that had been upgraded in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly destroyed or damaged patrol vessels used by Russia to protect exactly this type of high-value coastal target. This wasn't just a drone strike. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This was strategic decapitation. This was psychological warfare at its most refined. And psychological warfare is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the fall of Mariupol. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines Russian morale, Russian confidence, and Russian credibility. Today was the ultimate expression of that strategy. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall within a week. They thought Zelensky would flee to Poland. They thought the West would lose interest after the first winter. They thought Ukraine's military would collapse under sustained bombardment. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking targets inside Russia that were considered untouchable. Western support shows no signs of wavering. And Vladimir Putin, the man who projected invincibility for 2 decades, is now facing questions about his own personal security. For the first time, Russians are asking, if Ukraine can hit the president's palace, what else can they hit? That question is more dangerous to Putin than any battlefield defeat. What makes this moment so critical and so unpredictable is that Russia's threat came at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want immediate, devastating retaliation. Economic advisors want de-escalation to ease Western sanctions. Intelligence officials want time to assess how Ukraine penetrated Russian defenses so completely. And political allies want Putin to project strength without triggering a wider war. Putin is balancing these demands while facing a Ukrainian military that has just demonstrated it can reach him anywhere. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it from fear. Tonight, for perhaps the first time, Vladimir Putin is afraid. The Kremlin statement, now broadcast across Russian state media and shared with foreign governments through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Russia is not willing to accept any attacks on Putin's personal security infrastructure. Officials said plainly that Ukraine's strike was inconsistent with the rules of warfare and constitutes an act of terrorism against the Russian state. That is diplomatic language for, we consider this an act of war against Putin personally. You don't usually hear that tone from Moscow unless something existential is at stake. And tonight, the Kremlin believes something existential is at stake. Not the war in Ukraine, not Russian territorial gains, Putin's personal safety, his image of invincibility, his ability to project power without fear of consequence. All of that was shattered by a swarm of Ukrainian drones that Russian air defenses couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a calm, measured speech tonight. He said, "We did not start this war, but we will finish it." He said, "Every Russian who thought they could attack our homes without consequence now understands the truth." And he said, there is no palace, no bunker, no fortress where the architects of this genocide can hide from justice. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that Russia's threat is real. He knows that retaliation is coming, but he also knows that Ukraine cannot survive by playing defense alone. Tonight, Ukraine went on offense, and the world will never be the same. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's threat wasn't isolated. Along with the total annihilation statement, Russian nuclear forces reportedly increased their readiness posture, though officials insist this is precautionary. Russian cyber units launched attacks against Ukrainian government websites and banking systems. Russian military commanders increased artillery bombardments targeting civilian infrastructure in Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kiev. All of this happened within the same 12-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway, something that goes beyond rhetoric, something that could fundamentally change the nature of this conflict. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a massive retaliatory strike against Ukrainian government buildings in Kiev. Another is that Russia is attempting to use this incident to justify a new mobilization of Russian troops. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create the conditions for tactical nuclear use, framing Ukraine's strike as an existential threat to the Russian state. But today, Ukraine took that narrative card off the table. They didn't strike a nuclear facility. They didn't attack Russian civilian centers. They didn't target Russian military leadership directly. They struck a symbol, a palace, a monument to Putin's corruption and excess. And in doing so, they sent a message that cannot be spun as nuclear justification. This is personal. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Western support for Ukraine will waver under nuclear threats. Ukraine wants to show that no Russian target is beyond their reach. NATO wants to prevent escalation while maintaining alliance unity. And the world wants to prevent a regional war from becoming a global catastrophe. Every decision made in the next 72 hours will shape the trajectory of this conflict for months to come. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements in real time. They say Russian forces have increased activity near nuclear storage facilities, though they emphasize this could be precautionary rather than preparatory. They say communications intercepts suggest confusion within the Russian military about the scope of the damage and how Ukraine penetrated their defenses. And they say Russia's decision to issue such an extreme threat is likely part of a psychological warfare strategy intended to fracture Western unity and undermine Ukrainian morale. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their strike today, precise, devastating, and unapologetic, sent a message to Russia that Kyiv will not be intimidated. And it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains the most capable fighting force in Europe. As the hours go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Ukraine hoped to achieve and how Russia plans to respond. But what we do know is that Ukraine's strike was strategically timed. It exposed Russian air defense vulnerabilities. It humiliated Putin on the world stage. And it demonstrated that Ukraine possesses capabilities that Russia cannot counter. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the next 48 hours. If they respond with proportional military action, this moment will be remembered as a turning point in the war. If they escalate beyond conventional boundaries, NATO has already shown it is prepared to respond. Ukraine has shown the world tonight that they are ready. They have shown they are capable. They have shown they are unafraid. And tonight, for the first time since the invasion began, Vladimir Putin appears to be on the defensive. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing his options. It means he is choosing his next move with the knowledge that the world is watching. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has known before, but never truly felt. He is not untouchable. He is not invincible. And he is not safe. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine has changed the rules of this war. Russia has promised annihilation, and the world stands at the edge of something none of us fully understand. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.